Colony Station Epsilon 7 was the kind of place people ended up when they had nowhere else to go. The station hung in the darkness at the very edge of explored space, so far from anything important that most maps didn't even bother marking it. It was overcrowded, understaffed, and constantly breaking down. Refugees from failed mining colonies packed into every available space. The air recyclers wheezed. The water tasted metallic. The lights flickered at random intervals because nobody had time or resources to fix them properly. Everyone who lived there was surviving, not living. Just getting through each day. Finding enough food. Staying warm. Avoiding trouble. That was the extent of most people's ambitions on Epsilon 7. 11-year-old Beth Morgan lived on level 12. The lowest level of the station. The level where they put things nobody wanted to think about. Waste processing. Emergency life support backups that never got maintained. And the orphanage. The orphanage was a converted storage facility with metal walls that sweated condensation and floors that were always cold. 32 kids crammed into a space meant for cargo. Bunk beds stacked 3 high. One bathroom that never had hot water. A common room with furniture that had been used and broken and barely repaired so many times that nobody remembered what it originally looked like. Beth had been there for 3 years. Ever since her parents died in a mining accident on some asteroid nobody bothered naming. One day she had a family. The next day she had a station security officer telling her there had been an accident and she'd be going to the orphanage now. 3 years. It felt like 30. Life in the orphanage was simple in the worst way. Wake up when the lights came on at 0600 hours. Report to your assigned work shift because even kids had to contribute on a station where resources were scarce. Work for 6 hours. Return for your meal ration. Do homework on outdated tablets. Sleep. Wake up and do it all again. Beth's assignment rotated weekly. Sometimes she helped in the hydroponics bay, watering the struggling plants that provided some of the station's fresh food. Sometimes she worked in the laundry facility, washing uniforms for station personnel. This week, she'd drawn the worst assignment possible. Waste processing. The waste processing area was exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. A massive space filled with damaged cargo containers, broken equipment, and everything else the station didn't know what to do with but couldn't afford to jettison into space. Beth's job was to sort through it all. Separate the recyclable materials from the actual trash. Look for anything that could be repaired or repurposed. It was dirty work. Her hands were always scraped. Her clothes were always stained. She smelled like rust and chemicals and things that had been sitting too long in storage. But someone had to do it. Beth was 3 hours into her shift, pulling apart a cargo container that had been damaged in transit, when she heard something strange. A sound that didn't belong among the usual noises of the waste processing area. Not the hum of machinery or the clang of metal or the hiss of the air recyclers. Chirping. Weak and desperate. Coming from inside another damaged container about 20 feet away. Beth stopped what she was doing and listened. There it was again. Definitely chirping. Almost like a bird, but not quite. The sound had an odd quality to it. Musical in a way that Earth birds weren't. The container that made the sounds was marked with symbols Beth didn't recognize. Alien writing. That wasn't unusual. Epsilon 7 was a trading station, even if it was a poor one. Cargo from a dozen different species passed through regularly. Beth approached the container carefully. It had been damaged badly. One side was caved in. Scorch marks suggested it had been in a fire or an explosion. The locking mechanism was broken. The chirping got louder as she got closer. More desperate. It sounded like whatever was inside knew someone was there. Was calling for help. Beth grabbed a pry bar from her tool belt. The same tool she used to open stuck containers and break down junk for recycling. She wedged it into the gap where the container's door had been bent and pulled hard. Metal groaned. The door shifted slightly. Beth pulled harder, putting her whole body weight into it. Her muscles burned. Sweat dripped down her face despite the cold air. Finally, the door gave way with a screech that echoed through the processing area. Beth stumbled backward as the door swung open. The smell that came out was awful. Stale air mixed with something organic. Something that had been trapped in there too long. She waved her hand in front of her face and peered inside the dark container. At first, she couldn't see anything. Just shadows and the vague shapes of packing material. Then something moved. 2 small creatures huddled in the back corner. They were tiny, barely the size of house cats. Their bodies were covered in scales that shimmered even in the dim light. The scales shifted color slightly, like oil on water. Iridescent blues and greens and purples. They had 4 legs ending in tiny claws. Their bodies were lean and reptilian. Small wings were folded tight against their sides. The wings looked delicate, almost translucent, with visible veins running through them like leaves. But it was their eyes that caught Beth's attention. Large eyes that took up much of their small faces. Eyes that looked at her with an intelligence that was unmistakable. And with something else. Something that made Beth's chest tighten. Desperate hunger. The creatures chirped again. Weaker now. One of them tried to stand, but its legs shook and it collapsed back down. The other one didn't even try to move. Just stared at Beth with those huge eyes. Beth's breath caught in her throat. She knew what these were. She'd seen pictures in her school programs before her parents died. Before she ended up in the orphanage where education was whatever you could learn from broken tablets and outdated data files. These were Draka cubs. The Draka were one of the galaxy's great mysteries. An alien species that humans had barely made contact with. They lived in the deep reaches of space, far from the crowded trade routes and established colonies. Adult Draka were massive, some reports said as big as starships. They could fly through space without vessels, somehow surviving in the vacuum. They were intelligent, possibly more intelligent than humans, but they rarely communicated with other species. Nobody knew much about Draka reproduction or child-rearing. These cubs shouldn't exist here. Shouldn't be abandoned in a damaged cargo container on a forgotten station at the edge of space. But they were here. And they were dying. Beth could see it in the way their scales had lost their luster. In the way their breathing came fast and shallow. In the way they looked at her with eyes that had almost given up hope. They were starving. Beth's mind raced. She should report this to station security. Right now. Immediately. Draka cubs had to be valuable. Worth a fortune to researchers or collectors or whoever dealt in exotic alien creatures. The reward money could feed the entire orphanage for months. Maybe even a year. She could be a hero. The kid who found something worth selling. Maybe she'd even get adopted by someone grateful for the money. Maybe she'd get out of the orphanage. But as Beth stared at those two small creatures huddled in the corner of that dark container, all she could think about was how they looked exactly like she felt every single day. Alone. Scared. Hungry. Hoping someone would notice. Hoping someone would care. Nobody had cared about Beth in 3 years. Nobody had chosen her. Nobody had wanted her. These cubs were just babies. They hadn't asked to be here. Hadn't asked to be abandoned. They were innocent and scared and dying. Beth made a decision that would change absolutely everything. She reached into her jumpsuit pocket and pulled out her meal rations. The food she was supposed to eat today. 3 protein bars and a pouch of nutrient paste. Standard rations for station workers. Bland and barely enough, but it was what she had. It was supposed to last her 3 days until the next distribution. Beth tore open one of the protein bars and broke it into small pieces. She approached the cubs slowly, making soft sounds, trying not to scare them. They watched her with those huge eyes, too weak to run even if they wanted to. "It's okay," Beth whispered. "I won't hurt you. I promise. Here." She held out a piece of protein bar. The cubs didn't move at first. Then, slowly, one of them stretched its neck forward. Its small tongue touched the food. Then it ate desperately, nearly choking in its hurry. The second cub crawled forward and ate the next piece Beth offered. Their small bodies trembled with the effort. Beth fed them everything she had. All 3 protein bars broken into tiny pieces. The entire pouch of nutrient paste. She gave them her water ration too. Watched as they drank desperately. When the food was gone, the cubs looked at her differently. Not just with hunger anymore. With something else. Something that might have been gratitude. Or maybe trust. Beth knew she'd just made herself hungry for the next 3 days. Knew she'd have to find extra work or trade something to get more food. Knew this was probably the stupidest decision she'd ever made. But looking at those 2 small creatures who were slightly less desperate now, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Not yet anyway. Beth's head pounded as consciousness slowly returned. The lights above her were too bright, making her squint. Her mouth was dry. Her body felt weak and disconnected, like her limbs belonged to someone else. She was lying on a narrow bed with scratchy sheets. The smell of antiseptic cleaner filled her nose. Medical equipment beeped softly nearby. She was in the orphanage medical bay, a tiny room with 3 beds that served all 32 kids when they got sick or injured. Mrs. Patterson stood beside the bed with her arms crossed. The orphanage director was a thin woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to pull her whole face with it. She always looked stern, but right now she looked angry. "You've been skipping meals," Patterson said without any greeting or asking how Beth felt. Just straight to the accusation. The kitchen staff reported you haven't collected your rations in 6 days. Why? Beth's mind snapped into focus despite her weakness. Spark and Ember. Where were they? Were they okay? Had someone found them while she was unconscious? How long had she been out? She tried to sit up but her arms wouldn't cooperate properly. Everything felt heavy and slow. I asked you a question, Beth. Patterson's voice got sharper. Why have you been skipping meals? Do you have any idea how serious malnutrition is? You collapsed in the hallway. Danny found you and called for help. You could have died. Beth's brain scrambled for an explanation that wouldn't give away the cubs. I've been sick, she said, her voice coming out rough and weak. My stomach's been upset. No appetite. It wasn't a good lie. She could see Patterson didn't believe it. The director's eyes narrowed and she opened her mouth to say something else. That's when the alarm started. A blaring siren cut through the air. So loud it made Beth's already pounding head feel like it might split open. Red emergency lights started flashing in the hallway outside the medical bay. The kind of lights Beth had only seen during drills. An automated voice echoed through the station's speaker system. Calm but urgent. All personnel to stations. Unknown vessels approaching. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. All personnel to stations immediately. Patterson's stern expression shifted to confusion, then concern. She rushed to the medical bay's small terminal and pulled up a screen. Her face went pale as she read whatever information appeared there. Stay here, Patterson ordered Beth, already moving toward the door. Don't move. I need to find out what's happening. She disappeared into the hallway, leaving Beth alone with the blaring alarms and flashing red lights. Beth's heart raced. Unknown vessels approaching. That could mean anything. Pirates sometimes raided stations like Epsilon 7, looking for easy targets. But the announcement had said vessels, plural. Pirates usually traveled in small groups. And something about the timing felt wrong. Too coincidental. She'd collapsed. Spark and Ember had been alone for who knows how long. And now there were unknown vessels approaching. Beth forced herself to sit up despite the dizziness. She had to get to the cubs. Had to make sure they were okay. Had to hide them better if security started searching the station. She swung her legs off the bed. The floor felt cold under her bare feet. She was still wearing her work jumpsuit, stained and dirty from the waste processing area. Someone had removed her boots. Beth stood up slowly, holding onto the bed for support. The room spun for a moment, then settled. She took a few experimental steps. Weak, but she could walk. Meanwhile, 3 levels above in the station's command center, Captain Reynolds stared at the sensor screens like they were showing him something impossible. The command center was usually a quiet place. A circular room with stations for communications, sensors, navigation, and security. A large view screen on one wall typically showed the empty space surrounding the station. Maybe a passing cargo ship now and then. Nothing exciting ever happened at Epsilon 7. But right now, the command center was chaos. Sir, I'm reading hundreds of contacts, the sensor officer said, his voice climbing higher with each word. Approaching at 0.7 light speed. They'll reach us in less than 5 minutes. Hundreds. Reynolds gripped the back of the sensor officer's chair. He was a career military man who'd been assigned to Epsilon 7 as what everyone knew was a punishment posting. Nothing ever happened here. Until now. What kind of ships? Can you identify them? The sensor officer's hands flew over his controls. That's the thing, sir. They're not reading as ships exactly. The energy signatures are all wrong. There. He trailed off, checking his readings again like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. They're what? Reynolds demanded. They're biological, sir. Living creatures. But massive. Some of them are reading as large as heavy cruisers. The color drained from Reynolds's face. Living creatures the size of warships. There was only one species in known space that fit that description. Draka, he whispered. The word seemed to suck all the air out of the command center. Everyone turned to look at him. The Draka were legendary. Mysterious. Powerful beyond measure. And they almost never came to human space. Get me visual, Reynolds ordered. The main view screen flickered and changed. What appeared made several people in the command center gasp out loud. They filled the screen. Dozens, no, hundreds of them. Creatures that looked like the dragons from ancient Earth legends blown up to impossible size. Bodies covered in armored scales that reflected starlight. Wings that spanned hundreds of meters. Heads with intelligent eyes and mouths that could swallow small ships whole. They flew through space in perfect formation, moving with a grace that shouldn't be possible for anything that large. No exhaust trails. No visible propulsion. They simply moved through the vacuum like they were swimming through water. "Sir, they are hailing us," the communications officer said, her voice shaking. "Audio only." "Put it through," Reynolds said. Static crackled through the speakers. Then a voice came through. Deep and resonant, speaking human standard language with difficulty, like the speaker's mouth wasn't shaped for making those sounds. "Human station," the voice said. Each word was carefully pronounced. "Return our young. No harm will come if they are safe. Harm them, and your station becomes dust." The command center fell completely silent except for the quiet hum of equipment and the continued blaring of alarms in the background. "Our young?" Reynolds repeated. "We don't have any Draka here. There must be some mistake." But even as he said it, doubt crept into his mind. The Draka had come here for a reason. They didn't make mistakes. And if they thought their young were on this station. "Get me security," Reynolds ordered. "Station-wide search. Now. Look for anything that might be Draka. Any creatures. Any eggs. Anything." The security channel opened. "Sir, what exactly are we looking for?" Reynolds looked at the view screen, at the hundreds of dragons floating in space outside his station. Any one of them could tear Epsilon 7 apart. Together, they could reduce the entire station to debris in seconds. "I don't know," Reynolds admitted. "But find it. Search everywhere. We have maybe minutes before those things decide we're not cooperating." Security teams mobilized across the station. Officers ran through corridors, pulling up floor plans, assigning search sectors. The message went out to all levels: look for anything unusual. Anything that doesn't belong. Especially anything alive. In the medical bay, Beth heard all of this through the intercom system. Her blood ran cold. They were looking for Spark and Ember. The Draka outside were their family. Their people. They'd come looking for the cubs. Beth had to get to them first. Had to protect them. Had to make sure security didn't hurt them when they were found. She stumbled out of the medical bay into the hallway. Red lights flashed. People ran past, too focused on the emergency to notice one sick orphan kid wandering around. Beth made her way toward the maintenance access shaft where she'd hidden the cubs. Her legs felt like jelly. Her vision kept swimming. But she pushed forward. She had to reach them. Had to get there before security did. Above her, closer with each passing second, hundreds of dragons waited. Patient for now. But their patience had limits. And those limits were measured in minutes, not hours. The station's fate hung in the balance. And at the center of it all was an 11-year-old girl who'd made a simple choice to feed two hungry creatures. A choice that was about to change everything. Beth had made it to the maintenance shaft in time, but barely. Security found her there with Spark and Ember, and within minutes the cubs were in a containment unit being transported to the main docking bay. Beth had refused to leave their side, and surprisingly, the security team had let her come along. Maybe because the cubs went crazy whenever she moved too far away. Maybe because everyone was too scared of the dragons outside to argue. Now Beth sat in a shuttle heading toward those dragons. Captain Reynolds sat across from her, his face pale. Four security officers tried to look brave but their hands kept drifting to weapons everyone knew would be useless. Spark and Ember were in their containment unit beside Beth, pressing against the transparent walls trying to get closer to her. The shuttle bay doors opened and they launched into space. Beth had never been outside the station before. She pressed her face to the small window and stared. Space was so black. So empty. The stars looked different out here without the station's lights interfering. Then she saw them. The dragons. Even knowing they were coming, even seeing them on screens, nothing prepared her for the reality of seeing them in person. They were everywhere. Hundreds of them floating in formation around the station. Each one was massive beyond belief. Their bodies were longer than the shuttle by 10 times, maybe more. Scales covered them in overlapping plates that caught the light from distant stars and reflected it in rainbow patterns. Wings stretched out on either side, not flapping because there was no air to push against, but positioned just so, like they were riding invisible currents. Their heads were enormous. Intelligent eyes watched the shuttle approach. Mouths that could bite the shuttle in half. But they didn't attack. They just watched. Waited. "Oh my God," one of the security officers whispered. "We're all going to die." "Shut up," Reynolds snapped, but his voice shook too. The shuttle's navigation system guided them toward the largest dragon. It was easily twice the size of the others. Its scales were a deep blue that shifted to purple in the starlight. Scars marked its body, old wounds that had healed over. This was a creature that had lived a long time and seen many battles. "We're being directed to land on its back," the pilot said, voice cracking. "They want us to land on the dragon." There was a flat area between the dragon's shoulder blades, right where its wings connected to its body. The scales there formed a natural platform. The shuttle set down with a gentle bump. Through the window, Beth could see the scales moving slightly with the dragon's breathing. They were standing on a living creature. "Stay in the shuttle," Reynolds ordered. "Nobody moves until I say so." But the dragon had other plans. The platform they'd landed on began to shift. The dragon's entire body rippled with movement. Then, impossibly, it began to change shape. The massive form compressed. Folded in on itself. The wings drew inward. The long body shortened. It was like watching a video in reverse, or seeing water flow uphill. Something that shouldn't be possible but was happening right in front of them. In less than a minute, where there had been a dragon the size of a cruiser, now stood a figure roughly human-sized. Still clearly not human. Still clearly dragon. The scales remained, covering every inch of skin. The eyes were still reptilian. The hands ended in claws. But the shape was compressed enough to interact with beings as small as humans. "That's not in any of the reports," Reynolds breathed. The dragon figure approached the shuttle. She moved with impossible grace despite being on a surface that had no gravity. Her clawed hand touched the shuttle's outer door. A gentle tap. "I think she wants us to open it," the pilot said. "There's no air out there," a security officer protested. "We open that door and we die." But Beth could see through the window. There was a shimmer around the dragon figure. Some kind of field or bubble that extended several meters in all directions. Air, or something like it, contained by technology or ability Beth didn't understand. Reynolds made the call. "Open the door. But everyone stays behind me." The door hissed open. I rushed to equalize pressure, but then stabilized. They could breathe. Beth felt it on her face. Not quite like station air. It had a different taste. Cleaner somehow. But breathable. The dragon figure stood framed in the doorway. Up close, she was even more impressive. Her scales were like polished gems. Her eyes glowed faintly from within. When she spoke, her voice came through a small device attached to her chest. A translator, Beth realized. "I am Matriarch Kaidar," the voice said. Deep and resonant even through the mechanical translation. "Leader of this fleet. You will bring our young to me now." It wasn't a request. Reynolds nodded to the security officers. They carefully brought the containment unit forward. Kaidar's glowing eyes locked onto it immediately. Her expression changed. Softened somehow. The containment field deactivated at a gesture from Kaidar. Spark and Ember tumbled out, chirping loudly. They went straight to Kaidar, rubbing against her legs, making happy sounds Beth had never heard from them before. They were home. They were safe. They'd found their family. Kaidar knelt down, examining the cubs with careful attention. Her clawed hands ran over their scales. Checked their wings. Looked at their eyes and teeth. The cubs submitted to the inspection happily, clearly trusting this dragon completely. "They are well," Kaidar said, and Beth could hear surprise in her translated voice. "Better than they should be after a week alone and abandoned." She looked up at the humans standing in the shuttle doorway. "Better than I feared. Someone cared for them. Fed them. Kept them safe." She stood to her full height again. Even in her compressed form, she was taller than any of the humans. Her glowing eyes scanned each of them, evaluating, judging. "Who?" Kaidar asked. "Who cared for our young?" Captain Reynolds hesitated, then gestured toward Beth. "The girl. She found them in the waste processing area. She's been feeding them for a week." Every eye turned to Beth. Human and dragon both. Beth wanted to disappear. Wanted to hide. She'd never been good with attention. Never liked being the center of anything. Kaidar's massive eyes focused on her. Really focused. Like the dragon could see through her skin to everything inside. Beth felt small and weak and ridiculous standing there in her dirty work jumpsuit with her unwashed hair and the bruises from where she'd collapsed still visible on her arms. "Come forward, small one," Kaidar said. Beth's legs didn't want to move. But Spark and Ember were looking at her too, making their happy chirping sounds. She couldn't let them down. Slowly, carefully, Beth walked down the shuttle ramp and stood before the matriarch. Up close, Kaidar was even more intimidating. One of her clawed hands could wrap around Beth's entire body. One bite could end her. But Beth forced herself to stand still. To not run. To be brave even though every instinct screamed at her to hide. Why? Kaida asked. Her voice was gentler now but still overwhelming. Why did you save our young? Your kind barely knows us. You owe us nothing. They could have been dangerous. Could have harmed you. Why risk yourself? Beth swallowed hard. Her throat was dry. Her head still hurt from collapsing. But she answered honestly because lying to this dragon felt impossible. They were hungry and scared, Beth said quietly. Her voice sounded so small compared to Kaida's. Like me. I know what it's like to be alone. To be hungry. To hope someone notices you need help. She looked down at Spark and Ember. I couldn't just leave them. Kaida was silent for a long moment. Just staring at Beth with those glowing eyes. Then she made a sound. Deep and rumbling. It came from somewhere inside her chest and vibrated through the scales under everyone's feet. She turned to the other dragons floating in space around them. Spoke in her own language. A series of sounds that were part growl, part musical notes, part something Beth had no reference for. The fleet responded. Hundreds of dragons making sounds that shook the shuttle and made Beth's bones vibrate. You fed them what? Kaida turned back to Beth. My rations, Beth admitted. My food. It was all I had. You went hungry to feed our young? Something changed in Kaida's expression. For a week. Beth nodded. Kaida made that rumbling sound again. Louder this time. Then she spoke to Captain Reynolds. This child is malnourished. Unwell. Your people let her starve. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. She's from the orphanage. Resources on this station are limited. We provide what we can. You provide insufficient care, Kaida said flatly. She is a child. She should be fed. Protected. Valued. She looked back at Beth. You saved our young at cost to yourself. You showed them kindness when you had little to give. You asked for nothing in return. The dragon knelt down until her eyes were level with Beth's. Among my kind, when someone saves our young, especially at personal cost, they become family. It is our highest law. Our deepest tradition. She paused. We would like to offer you adoption into our fleet. To become one of us. To be family. The words hung in the air like they were physical things. Beth's brain couldn't process them. Adoption? Family? Huh? Behind her, the humans in the shuttle stood in shocked silence. Captain Reynolds's mouth opened and closed without sound. This was unprecedented. Impossible. A human child adopted by dragons? She's human, Reynolds finally managed. She belongs with her own kind. She can't just leave. Kaida's eyes never left Beth, but her translated voice grew colder. Her own kind left her in an orphanage to starve while working her like an adult. We do not abandon family. We do not let our young go hungry. She focused entirely on Beth now. The choice is yours, small one. But know this, if you join us, you will never be hungry again. Never be alone. Never be unwanted. We choose you. Those last 3 words hit Beth harder than anything else. We choose you. Nobody had chosen Beth in 3 years. Nobody had wanted her. Until now. 1 year had passed since that day on the shuttle. 365 days that had transformed Beth Morgan from a starving orphan on a forgotten station into something entirely new. Something nobody in the galaxy had seen before. Beth stood in her quarters aboard the bioship Sanctuary, looking at her reflection in the polished metal that served as a mirror. She was 12 now. Taller. Stronger. Healthier than she'd ever been in her life. Her skin had a glow to it from actually getting proper nutrition. Her hair, which had been dull and brittle in the orphanage, now shone. She'd gained weight, real muscle instead of the thin weakness of malnutrition. But the biggest changes weren't physical. They were in how she carried herself. How she looked at the world. There was a confidence there now that hadn't existed before. Not arrogance. Just the quiet certainty of someone who knew they were wanted. Who knew they belonged. Her quarters were unlike anything else in the galaxy. The Draka had built them specifically for her, and the result was a strange but beautiful blend of 2 completely different worlds. One half of the room was designed for a human. A bed that was actually comfortable. A desk and chair built to human proportions. Storage for clothes and personal items. Climate control that kept the temperature comfortable for a species that evolved on a planet with breathable atmosphere. The other half was pure Draka. Curved walls that seemed organic rather than constructed. Bioluminescent panels that provided light without any visible power source. Surfaces that were warm to the touch, almost alive. An opening that led to the larger communal spaces where the Draka gathered, spaces too large and too different for a human to live in comfortably but perfect for visiting. The bioship itself was hard to explain to people who'd never seen one. It wasn't a ship in the traditional sense. It was a living creature. Ancient and massive and intelligent in ways that human science couldn't quite measure. The Draka had formed symbiotic relationships with these creatures thousands of years ago. The bioships provided transportation and living space. The Draka provided protection and care in return. Sanctuary was one of the largest bioships in the fleet. It housed nearly 100 Draka of various ages, from newly hatched cubs to elders who'd lived for centuries. And now it housed one human girl who'd somehow become part of their family. Beth had spent the year learning everything. Constantly. The Draka approach to education was intense. They believed young minds should be challenged, pushed, filled with knowledge and skills as fast as they could absorb them. She'd learned their language. Not just the translated words but the actual sounds. The Draka communicated through a combination of audible speech and frequencies that most species couldn't hear. Beth couldn't produce all the sounds with her human vocal cords, but she'd learned to understand them. To hear the emotional undertones and subtle meanings that the translation devices missed. She'd learned their customs. How to greet an elder with proper respect. How to show affection to family members. How to participate in their celebrations and ceremonies. How to navigate the complex social structures of a species that valued honor and family bonds above almost everything else. She attended lessons with young Draka every day. Cubs who were roughly her age, though they matured at different rates. They learned together how to read stellar currents, the invisible rivers of gravity and electromagnetic force that flowed through space. How to navigate by feeling these currents rather than relying on instruments. How to sense the presence of other beings across vast distances through methods that human science would call telepathy but the Draka simply called awareness. Beth couldn't do everything the Draka cubs could. She'd never be able to fly through space unprotected. Never be able to breathe vacuum or withstand the radiation of close solar approaches. Her human biology had hard limits. But she could learn to think like them. To see the universe through their eyes. And in some ways, her human perspective brought things to the lessons that even the Draka teachers found valuable. She asked questions they'd never considered. Made connections between concepts that seemed obvious to her but novel to them. The biggest visible change was Spark and Ember. The two cubs she'd fed in that maintenance shaft were barely recognizable now. They'd grown at an incredible rate once they had proper nutrition and care. Now, 1 year later, they were massive. Each one was the size of an adult elephant. Their scales had darkened and strengthened into proper armor. Their wings had developed fully, capable of carrying them through space for short distances, though they wouldn't reach their full flying range for several more years. Their eyes had matured, glowing faintly with the inner light that marked all adult Draka. But they still recognized Beth as their sister. Still followed her around Sanctuary like oversized puppies. Still made those happy chirping sounds when she entered a room, though now the sounds were deep enough to vibrate through the floor. And they were fiercely, intensely protective of her. Whenever other ships approached Sanctuary, whenever strangers came aboard, Spark and Ember would position themselves between the newcomers and Beth. Their body language made it absolutely clear, you do not touch our sister. You do not threaten her. You do not even look at her wrong. Nobody in the galaxy was stupid enough to mess with someone who had two growing dragons as protective siblings. Beth hadn't cut ties with humanity despite living among the Draka. She couldn't. Part of her would always be human. Would always remember where she came from. Would always care about the people she'd left behind. She called Danny every week. Her friend from the orphanage was still there, still waiting for adoption that probably wouldn't come. Their conversations were strange now. Danny's life hadn't changed at all. Same cramped rooms. Same rationed food. Same boring routine. While Beth's life had transformed completely. It's so weird talking to you now, Danny had said during their last call. You sound different. Like an adult or something. I'm still me, Beth had insisted. Just me with a family now. A family of space dragons, Danny had laughed. Normal people get adopted by couples with jobs and apartments. You get adopted by an alien armada. But Beth could hear the loneliness under Danny's jokes. Could hear how hard it was for him to watch her new life while he remained stuck in the old one. So Beth had done something about it. She talked to Kaida about the orphanage. About the kids there who had nothing. Who went hungry. Who had no hope of anything better. Kaida's response had been immediate, they are your family too. Human family. And family helps family. Within a month, the Draka had arranged regular supply deliveries to Station Epsilon 7. Food, medical supplies, educational materials, equipment for the orphanage. Not charity exactly. The Draka framed it as trade, providing resources in exchange for minor station services. That way the humans could accept it without feeling like they were taking handouts. But everyone knew the truth. The dragons were taking care of their adopted daughter's people. The orphanage conditions had improved dramatically. The kids had better food, warmer clothes, working equipment. Hope that maybe someone somewhere cared about them. Beth had become something unprecedented in galactic politics. A bridge between two species that had barely interacted before. When tensions arose between humans and Draka, when misunderstandings threatened to escalate, Beth could explain human emotional responses to the Draka and Draka logic to the humans. She was 12 years old. She should have been in middle school worrying about homework and friends and normal kid problems. Instead, she was sitting in on diplomatic meetings, helping negotiate trade agreements, explaining cultural differences to beings that had lived for centuries. It was overwhelming sometimes. The weight of being the first, the only, the human girl living with dragons. But Kaida always reminded her that she didn't have to carry that weight alone. You are family first, Kaida would say. Ambassador second. Child always. Do not forget to simply be young. So Beth made sure to balance the serious responsibilities with normal things. She played games with the younger cubs. Explored Sanctuary's vast interior spaces. Read books from Earth that the Draka downloaded for her. Video called her friends. Did homework because yes, the Draka believed in mathematics and science education even if their methods were completely different from human schools. She was living an impossible life. A life that shouldn't exist. A starving orphan adopted by space dragons. It sounded like a story someone made up. Too fantastical to be real. But it was real. It was her life now. And despite the weirdness, despite the challenges, despite being the only human among hundreds of dragons, Beth had never been happier. Because she'd learned something important that year. Something that changed how she saw everything. Family wasn't about biology. Wasn't about looking the same or coming from the same planet or even breathing the same air. Family was about being chosen. Being wanted. Being loved for exactly who you were. The Draka had chosen her. A small, weak human child with nothing to offer except kindness to two starving cubs. And in choosing her, they'd given her everything. Years passed in ways that felt both impossibly fast and comfortably slow. Beth grew from a 12-year-old girl into a young woman, and with each year, her role in the galaxy grew more significant. Not because she sought importance or power, but because she existed in a space no one had occupied before. She was the bridge. The translator. The living proof that family could transcend species. By 15, Beth was attending formal diplomatic meetings between human governments and Draka fleets. She'd sit in rooms with ambassadors 3 times her age, helping them understand each other. When humans spoke about emotional needs and social connections, the Draka would look confused. Beth would explain it in terms they understood. When Draka talked about honor bonds and flight patterns as communication, humans would get lost. Beth would translate the concepts into human frameworks. She helped write the first official protocols for interspecies adoption. It was delicate work. You couldn't just let any species adopt any child. There were biological needs to consider. Psychological compatibility. Environmental requirements. Safety concerns. But Beth pushed for one core principle to be at the center of everything. The child's choice and welfare came first. Always. A desperate parent might make a bad decision, Beth had argued during one heated committee meeting. But a child knows when they're wanted. When they're safe. When they're loved. Listen to them. The protocols passed with that principle embedded in their foundation. Within 2 years, the first official interspecies adoptions began happening. A human couple adopted a young Valyrian whose parents had died in an accident. A Grundon family took in human twins from a destroyed colony. A Draka elder adopted an Aerith child whose species had difficulty caring for young alone. Each case was different. Each one required careful consideration and support. But they worked. Families formed across species lines. And Beth's story was cited every time as proof it was possible. She never forgot where she came from. Never let the diplomatic responsibilities or the increasing fame make her forget the cold floors of the orphanage. The hunger that made her stomach hurt. The loneliness that felt like a physical weight. Those memories stayed with her, sharp and clear, even as years passed. Those memories drove her work. Every protocol she helped write. Every adoption she consulted on. Every speech she gave. It all came back to that 11-year-old girl who'd fed 2 starving cubs because she understood what hunger felt like. When Beth turned 18, she made a decision. She requested permission from Kaida to return to Station Epsilon 7. Not for a quick visit this time. For something permanent. I want to leave something there, Beth explained to her Draka mother. Something that will last. So the kids who come after have something to look at. Something to give them hope. Kaida had simply nodded. Then we will make it so. The journey back to Epsilon 7 felt strange. Beth hadn't been there in nearly 3 years. She'd been busy. Growing up. Learning. Working. The station had felt so huge when she was 11. Now, approaching in the shuttle with Spark and Ember flying escort outside, it looked small. Fragile. Just a tiny structure floating in the vastness of space. But it was still important. Still home to hundreds of people trying to survive. Still housing that orphanage where kids waited and hoped for something better. The station had changed too. The Draka support over the years had helped. The corridors weren't quite as run down. The lights didn't flicker as much. There was money for repairs now. For maintenance. For making the station actually livable instead of barely survivable. Beth made her way to level 12. The lowest level. The forgotten level that wasn't quite so forgotten anymore. The orphanage had been renovated. Not luxurious, but decent. Clean. Warm. The kids there had real beds now instead of stacked bunks. Had enough food. Had teachers and counselors instead of just a director trying to manage too many kids with too few resources. Mrs. Patterson was still there, though she'd aged considerably. Her hair was completely gray now. More lines marked her face. But she smiled when she saw Beth, something the stern director had rarely done in the old days. Look at you, Patterson said. All grown up. We've been following your work. You're famous now. I'm just me, Beth said, uncomfortable with the word famous. I just want to help kids like I was. You're helping more than you know, Patterson replied. The support from your Draka family changed everything here. We can actually give these kids a chance now. They walked through the orphanage together. Beth saw the differences everywhere. Art on the walls that kids had made. Toys that weren't broken. Books that weren't falling apart. But most importantly, she saw the difference in the kids themselves. They didn't have that defeated look she remembered from her time here. That sense of hopelessness. They still wanted families, still hoped for adoption, but they weren't starving while they waited. Danny had been adopted 2 years ago by a human couple who ran a small manufacturing business on a colony world. Beth had attended the adoption ceremony via video call, had watched her friend finally get the family he deserved. He was doing well, Patterson reported. Sent messages sometimes. Was learning the business. Had younger siblings now through his adopted parents. Was happy. Beth was genuinely thrilled for him, but it also hurt a little. Not jealousy. Just the strange sadness of growing up and growing apart from people who'd once been your whole world. Outside the orphanage, in the main corridor of level 12, Beth had arranged for something special. A sculpture had been created by a Draka artist who specialized in metal work. It stood 7 feet tall, made from an alloy that would last for centuries without corroding or fading. The sculpture showed a small human child kneeling down, holding out food to 2 tiny dragon cubs. The child's face was tilted down, focused on the cubs. The cubs were looking up at her with hope in their crystalline eyes. It was beautifully detailed. You could see the hunger in the cubs' thin bodies. The patches on the child's worn clothing. The gentle care in how the child held out the food. At the base of the sculpture, a plaque had been mounted. Beth had written the words herself, revised them a dozen times until they said exactly what she meant. The plaque read, "Kindness knows no species. Family is chosen, not given. May all who pass here remember that the smallest act of compassion can change worlds." The unveiling ceremony was small. Just Beth, Patterson, the current orphanage kids, and a few station officials. And Spark and Ember, who'd compressed themselves down to human size to attend, standing on either side of their sister like honor guards. Beth pulled the cloth off the sculpture and stepped back. The orphanage kids crowded around it, looking up at the image of the girl and the cubs. Some of them knew the story. Others were hearing it for the first time from their friends in excited whispers. "That's you?" a small boy asked Beth, pointing between her and the sculpture. "That was me," Beth corrected gently. 7 years ago. When I was your age. When I lived here just like you." "And now you live with dragons?" a girl asked, eyes wide. "I do," Beth confirmed. Because I helped 2 dragon cubs when they needed it. And they helped me back. That's what family does. Can we be adopted by dragons too? Another kid asked hopefully. Beth smiled. Maybe. If it's the right match. If you and a Draka family choose each other. But there are lots of kinds of families. Human families. Alien families. What matters is finding people who want you. Who'll take care of you. Who'll love you. She looked at all the kids gathered around the sculpture. Different ages. Different backgrounds. All of them hoping for the same thing she'd hoped for in this same orphanage. Don't give up, Beth told them. I know it's hard. I know it feels like maybe nobody will ever want you. But somewhere out there, there's a family looking for exactly who you are. Sometimes they're human. Sometimes they're not. But they're out there. And until you find them, be kind. Help others when you can. Because you never know when a small act of kindness will change everything. The story of the orphan girl and the dragon cubs had already been spreading across the galaxy for years. But that sculpture on Station Epsilon 7 made it permanent. Made it real in a way that news stories and reports couldn't quite capture. People came to see it. Travelers passing through the station would detour to level 12 just to look at the sculpture. To read the plaque. To remember that family could take unexpected forms. The story was told to children on hundreds of worlds now. Sometimes it was told accurately. Sometimes details changed in the retelling. But the core remained the same. A child helped those who needed it, and in doing so, found the family she needed too. It became a founding story of the interspecies adoption movement. When skeptics argued that species were too different to form real family bonds, people pointed to Beth and her dragon family. When cynics claimed that aliens and humans could never truly understand each other, Beth's work as a bridge proved them wrong. 5 years after the sculpture was placed, Beth returned to Station Epsilon 7 again. She was 23 now. She just finished negotiating a major treaty between 3 different species about adoption rights and child welfare protections. She went down to level 12 to see the sculpture like she always did when visiting the station. And she found something that made her stop and stare. The area around the sculpture had become a shrine of sorts. People left offerings. Not religious offerings exactly, but tokens. Small toys for the symbolic cubs. Flowers. Notes written by kids who'd been adopted, thanking Beth for giving them hope while they waited. Pictures drawn by children showing their own adopted families, human and alien mixed together. An elderly woman was standing in front of the sculpture when Beth arrived. The woman had tears running down her weathered face. Can I help you? Beth asked gently. The woman turned and gasped when she recognized Beth. You're her. The girl from the story. I am, Beth admitted. My grandson, the woman said, voice shaking with emotion, was adopted last year by a Valerian couple. He'd been in the orphanage here for 4 years. 4 years of waiting. Hoping. When I heard the Valorians wanted to adopt him, I was scared. I didn't want to lose him to aliens. But then I read your story. Saw how happy you were with your Draka family. And I realized. She paused to wipe her eyes. I realized that love is love. Family is family. It doesn't matter what species anyone is. She reached out and squeezed Beth's hand. Thank you. For showing us that it's possible. That it's good. My grandson is so happy now. And I got to keep him in my life. The Valorians bring him to visit. They include me. We're all family now. Beth felt her own eyes burning with tears. This is what it was about. Not the fame or the diplomatic achievements or being the first. This. Helping families form. Helping kids find homes. Helping people see past their differences to the love underneath. That night, Beth stood on Sanctuary's observation deck with Kaida beside her. Spark and Ember, now fully grown and magnificent, flew in formation outside. They were enormous, each one the size of a space station, but they still stayed close to their sister. Still protective after all these years. Do you ever regret it? Kaida asked. Leaving humanity behind? Choosing us? Beth thought about that question. Really thought about it. She'd been asked similar things 100 times over the years. But she'd never quite found the perfect answer. Until now. I didn't leave humanity behind, Beth said slowly. I expanded what family could mean. And I didn't choose you just because you're Draka. I chose you because when I had nothing, you saw someone worth saving. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was alone, you gave me family. She looked at her dragon mother. That's what family does. That's what matters. Not what species anyone is. Just that we choose each other. Kaida made that deep rumbling sound that meant pride and love. You have changed the galaxy, little one. One small act of kindness created ripples that will last for generations. Beth smiled. I just fed 2 hungry cubs. Everything else just happened. No, Kaidar corrected gently. You saw someone in need and helped them even when you had little to give. That is never just anything. That is everything. Below them, figuratively speaking, since direction was relative in space, colonies and stations across the galaxy were settling down for their night cycles. On hundreds of those worlds, children were being tucked into bed by parents who didn't share their DNA or even their basic biology. Families that worked because love transcended species. And somewhere on every one of those worlds, at least one person knew the story of the orphan girl and the dragon cubs. Knew that family was chosen, not given. Knew that kindness had power beyond measure. Beth Morgan was 23 years old. She'd started as a starving orphan who'd made one desperate choice to feed 2 dying cubs with her last meal. That choice had changed everything. Not just for her. Not just for Spark and Ember. But for the entire galaxy. Because sometimes, the smallest acts of compassion really do change worlds. And sometimes, being chosen by family you never expected is exactly what you needed all along. The end.